When I was a kid, I had a very active imagination. I loved to write stories, draw pictures, make comics, and so forth, but most of my efforts were focused on developing what I later learned is called the Paracosm, a persistent, detailed imaginary world. My real-life story isn't all that interesting. It's probably not that dissimilar to many of yours in the broad strokes. So instead of taking you through a dull, plodding reminiscence of my actual past, for the next few minutes I'm going to invite you into my Paracosm, the world that I, in some sense, really lived in for most of my childhood. When I was very young, I developed a strong interest in science. I had a set of old books from the Time and Life Science Library. These were probably from the mid-'60s, so pretty old, even at the time that I had them. And I used to sit in my room and pore over these books, fascinated by the vibrant illustrations and the complex technical terminology. It's obvious to an adult's eye that I didn't fully understand what I was reading, but that's not how it seemed to me then. In my mind, I was a brilliant scientist, with complete mastery of the most esoteric technical fields. I remember my parents being called in after school one time. This was probably around first grade. I had taped to my desk a variety of self-drawn reference materials, as I called them, like a crib sheet a college student might make, but filled with scientific information of dubious veracity. For example, I drew a labeled diagram of a uranium molecule that consisted of a single white sphere with a plus sign on it, surrounded by orbiting electrons. I don't exactly recall my detailed explanation for this diagram, but I vehemently rejected my parents' suggestion that it may not be a precisely accurate representation of the molecular structure of uranium. So unhappily, I was forced to clean off my desk. Great scientific minds are so often persecuted for their brilliance. Well, with my unquestionably world-class credentials, I founded a small business called the Searsware Chemical Company, in which I developed various concoctions of household chemicals. For example, I remember one time trying to sell my grandfather a mixture of water, dirt, soap, and food coloring that I marketed as something like a lubricant for riding lawnmowers. Now here's where the fantasy begins to blur with the reality. The Searsware Chemical Company eventually expanded into other operations and was rechristened Sean Science Company. I constructed a fancy new headquarters filled with complex machinery entirely of my own design, and I employed a number of my classmates, but I'm not entirely sure what they did all day, as I seem to be the one coming up with all of the earth-shattering breakthroughs. Inspired by various science fiction movies and TV shows, most notably Star Wars and a small Australian show called Ocean Girl that played on the Disney Channel, Sean Science Company developed an extensive deep-sea exploration program, where we discovered the remnants of an ancient spacefaring civilization that had centuries earlier abandoned Earth in favor of the stars. Building on the technology they left behind, I very quickly managed to assemble a fleet of faster-than-light space cruisers and began exploring the far reaches of the galaxy. Well, unfortunately, a classmate of mine named Blake had similar designs, and thus began months of bloody warfare between the forces of Sean Science Company and the forces of Blake Science Company. I'm not entirely sure that Blake was aware, while he went about his second-grade business, that he was locked in an epic battle for the future of mankind. But in any event, I emerged victorious and assumed the title of Supreme Commander of the newly rechristened Commaterials. By this point, the earthly operations of Sean Science Company had essentially ceased. The focus was firmly on the domination of outer space. I'll interject that I'm a bit fuzzy on how I managed all this space travel while still attending school and getting my homework done, but I think it had something to do with time dilation. In any case, the Commaterials did not go unnoticed to the other spacefaring races of the galaxy. I was eventually contacted by the Entroponians, the descendants of the earthly civilization, whose remains I had years earlier discovered at the bottom of the ocean. As it turns out, I just so happened to be descended from an Entroponian bloodline, and they asked me to become their leader. Well, to make a long story short, the Entroponian universe grew increasingly detailed over the years, expanding from a simple space opera to stories of parallel universes, time travel, the origins of life, etc. At home, I would take frequent walks around the neighborhood, imagining various scenarios in the world that I had created. Whenever I saw a movie with an interesting plot element or a particularly compelling action sequence, I just had to incorporate it into my world. It really wasn't until college that I stopped expanding on my Paracosm. This wasn't a conscious decision. I think once I started focusing on my career, everything else just fell into the background. I no longer had time for the Entroponians, for the Commaterials, for Sean Science Company. It sometimes makes me a little sad, like I've lost a significant part of myself, traded in that childhood creativity and sense of wonder for an ordinary life and a productive, real people job. But sometimes when I lie in bed at night, I'll still imagine an epic space battle with myself at the helm of a command ship. Then I'll smile and drift off into the world of dreams. Thank you.